how Greek parties were actually like, and why you probably wouldn't survive one. It begins after sunset. Not with music, not with shouting, but with preparation. Because in ancient Greece, a party was not chaos, it was ritual. The word was symposium, which does not mean wild celebration. It means drinking together, and that detail matters. Because a Greek party was not about dancing wildly in the streets. It was about reclining, debating, drinking diluted wine, and proving you were clever enough to survive the conversation. You would not be standing. You would be lying down, on a couch, propped on one elbow, trying not to spill wine on your tunic. The room would be lit by oil lamps, flickering shadows climbing the painted walls. Slaves would move quietly between guests, refilling cups, adjusting cushions, mixing wine in a large bowl called a krater. The wine was never drunk pure. That was barbaric. It was mixed with water. Always. Because losing control too quickly was shameful. Ironically, losing control slowly was expected. The first rule of a Greek party: you do not arrive uninvited. These gatherings were private, elite, male-dominated. Respectable Athenian women did not attend. Instead, you would see heterae, educated courtesans trained in music, conversation, poetry. They were often more intellectually involved than the men. This was not a random gathering. It was a curated environment. Before drinking began, a libation was poured. A small offering to Dionysus, god of wine, god of ecstasy, god of losing control, but only after honoring him first. Religion was not separate from entertainment. It structured it. At first, the atmosphere was restrained. Conversation, politics, philosophy, poetry recitations. You might hear someone quote Homer, or argue about justice, or challenge another guest to define virtue, and if you failed to answer well, you would not be thrown out. You would simply be remembered. And in Athens, reputation was everything. Then the drinking deepened. Games began. One of the most popular was kotabos. You flicked the last drops of wine from your cup at a target across the room. Miss, and you were mocked. Hit, and you gained admiration. The game required balance and coordination, which became increasingly difficult. Music followed. A lyre, a flute, songs that everyone pretended to know. Sometimes political satire, sometimes love poetry, sometimes deeply inappropriate jokes. Greek parties were not prudish, but they were structured. There was always a host, and often a symposiarch, the master of the drinking. He decided how strong the wine mixture would be, how fast it would be served, how long the night would last. Without him, things would unravel too quickly, and they often did anyway. You imagine Greek parties as wild chaos, and yes, sometimes they became that. Men stumbling into the streets at dawn, shouting poetry at closed doors, knocking over market stalls. But this was the end, not the beginning. The beginning was intellectual, measured, almost formal. The strange truth: a Greek party was closer to a philosophical salon than a nightclub. Plato's Symposium, one of the most famous philosophical texts ever written, is literally set at a party. Guests debate the nature of love while drinking, and no one thinks this is unusual, because for Greeks, drinking and thinking were not opposites. They were companions. But here is the part you might not survive: the pressure. You were expected to speak well, to argue clearly, to drink without collapsing, to perform socially. Silence was noticed, stupidity was remembered, and arrogance was punished through mockery. This was not passive entertainment. It was participation. And then, slowly, control dissolved. Wine levels increased. Voices grew louder. Debates became personal. Someone insulted someone else's politics, or poetry, or masculinity, and then, perhaps, the order collapsed. But even chaos had rules, because Greek society was obsessed with balance. Too much restraint made you dull. Too much indulgence made you barbaric. The perfect Greek party existed between those extremes, and staying there required skill. So how were Greek parties actually like? Structured, competitive, religious, intellectual, and eventually dangerous. Not because of violence, but because they revealed who you were. Under wine, under pressure, under expectation. Because that was the real test of a Greek party. Not how much you could drink, but who you became while drinking. Wine in ancient Greece was not just a beverage. It was a social amplifier. It lowered restraint, but it also magnified character. The Greeks believed that moderation, sophrosine, was one of the highest virtues. A man who could hold his wine without losing dignity proved that he possessed balance. A man who could not was revealing something deeper, and everyone was watching. At a symposium, you were never alone in your intoxication. Every joke you made, every argument you lost, every boast you exaggerated, it all became part of your reputation. The next morning, when the lamps had burned out and the wine bowl sat empty, the memory of your behavior remained. You could not hide from it. There was also competition woven into the evening. Guests challenged one another to improvised poetry, to riddles, to philosophical positions. A host might declare a topic: love, courage, justice, and each man would speak in turn. You were expected to be clever, persuasive, original, and if you failed, the laughter was not cruel, but it was sharp. Mockery in Greek culture was a tool. It reinforced boundaries. It reminded everyone of their place. A symposium could elevate you socially. It could also diminish you. Then there were the rituals of intoxication. The symposiarch, master of the drinking, decided how strong the wine mixture would be. 3 parts water to 1 part wine, or 2 to 1. A stronger mixture signaled a wilder night ahead. But even then, there were rules. Drinking unmixed wine was considered barbaric, something only foreigners did. Civilized men diluted their wine. They respected the balance between ecstasy and control, at least at first. As the evening deepened, formality softened. Sandals were kicked aside, tunics loosened, music grew louder. The flute player's melodies slipped from structured songs into something more improvisational. The debates became less philosophical and more personal. Political tensions could surface. Rivalries sharpened. Alliances formed quietly over shared opinions and shared cups. The symposium was a microcosm of the city. Democracy did not stop at the door. It entered the room, reclined on a couch, and drank with everyone else. And then there was Dionysus. Even if unspoken, his presence hovered over every gathering. He was the god of wine, yes, but also the god of transformation, of crossing boundaries, of becoming something other than what you were in daylight. Under his influence, laughter could become hysteria, confidence could become recklessness, intimacy could become vulnerability. The Greeks understood this duality. That wine revealed truth, but also distorted it. That ecstasy could liberate or unravel. Not all symposia ended peacefully. Some dissolved into street processions at dawn, drunken groups singing loudly, banging on doors, demanding entry into homes of friends or rivals. These were called komos, rowdy celebrations that spilled beyond private space into public life. The controlled interior of the symposium gave way to chaotic movement through the city. Torches flickered in narrow streets. Voices echoed against stone walls, and what began as measured discourse ended as spectacle. But even this had meaning. Greek culture did not separate reason and excess completely. It saw them as part of a cycle. Order gave way to disorder. Disorder returned to order. The next morning, men woke with dry mouths and heavy heads. They returned to their roles. Citizen, soldier, politician, as if the transformation had been temporary. And in a sense, it was. Yet something lingered. The memory of what was said, of what was revealed, of who had impressed and who had embarrassed themselves. That was the real power of a Greek party. It was not escapism. It was exposure, under pressure, under expectation. Under wine, you were not just drinking. You were being measured. When order slipped, by the time the second krater of wine was mixed, the room had changed. Not dramatically, not yet, but subtly. Voices were louder. Laughter lasted a little too long. The careful posture of reclining men began to loosen into something less composed. Sandals had been kicked aside. Someone had begun tapping rhythm against the floor. The symposium was entering its second phase, and this was where things became unpredictable. At first, the host still controlled the tempo. The symposiarch would call for another dilution, perhaps stronger this time. 2 parts water to 1 part wine. A signal that restraint was softening. Cups were refilled. The oil lamps burned lower. Shadows on the walls grew longer and more distorted. The philosophical debates that once revolved around virtue or justice began drifting into more personal territory. Someone challenged another's political loyalty. Someone mocked a recent speech in the assembly. Someone questioned a rival's courage in battle. Wine did not create tension. It revealed it, and Greek society was full of tension. Athens, especially, was a democracy, but a fragile one. Citizens competed constantly for honor, influence, recognition. A symposium brought these men together in one room, removed from public order, but not from ego. The difference was that now they were reclining, drinking, exposed. A careless word could linger longer than the wine itself. Then came the games. Kotabos grew louder, cups flicked with more force. Targets were missed more often. Cheers turned into jeers. Someone accused another of cheating. Someone demanded a rematch. Music intensified. The flute player's melody grew sharper, more urgent. The rhythm encouraged clapping, then shouting. A guest might begin an improvised song, half poetic, half obscene. Respectability was slipping. And yet, this too had structure. The presence of heterae, educated courtesans, shifted the atmosphere further. They were not passive entertainment. Many were skilled conversationalists, musicians, even philosophers in their own right. They sang. They played instruments. They challenged men's arguments. They also reminded everyone that this was not the respectable domestic world of wives and family. This was a male space of performance and status. Desire hovered in the background, not crude, but present. The Greeks believed that wine loosened the soul. Under its influence, truth emerged. This belief made the symposium dangerous, because if wine revealed truth, then every confession, every insult, every boast carried weight. A man who bragged too much was seen as insecure. A man who grew silent might be seen as weak. A man who lost control entirely risked being labeled barbaric. Balance was everything. But balance grew harder to maintain. Eventually, the atmosphere tipped. Someone stood up too quickly and nearly stumbled. Another laughed uncontrollably at something only half funny. A debate turned heated, not intellectually, but emotionally. Voices rose. Hands gestured sharply. The symposiarch might attempt to restore order, calling for a song, a toast, a shift in topic. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it did not. If it did not, the evening could fracture. A guest might storm out, insulted, Another might challenge someone to a more serious confrontation the next day. Alliances could form in whispers, while others were distracted. The symposium was no longer just a party. It was political theater. And then came the Comos, when the wine bowl was nearly empty and discipline fully dissolved. The gathering could spill into the streets. Torches were grabbed. Songs shouted into the night. Doors knocked upon. Sometimes playfully, sometimes aggressively, drunken revelers paraded through Athens' narrow streets, singing hymns to Dionysus or bawdy chants about love and rivalry. The controlled indoor ritual transformed into public spectacle. Order had become movement. But here is what makes Greek parties different from modern chaos. The next morning mattered. Everything that happened during the symposium had consequences. In a society built on reputation, public memory was sharp. The assembly would still meet. Legal disputes would still occur. Military service would still demand discipline. You could not separate your drunken self from your public self. They were the same person. That is why you might not survive a Greek party, not physically, socially. The pressure to be clever, composed, entertaining, bold, but not too bold, required skill. The margin between admiration and embarrassment was thin. Too restrained, and you were dull. Too wild, and you were barbaric. Too quiet, and you were forgettable. The perfect Greek man navigated this balance effortlessly. Most did not. By dawn, the oil lamps had burned out, cups lay tipped over. Music had stopped. The streets grew quiet again. Men returned home with the faint smell of wine clinging to their tunics. The symposium ended, but its memory lingered, because a Greek party was never just about drinking. It was about testing character. Under wine, under scrutiny, under the watchful eyes of a society that never forgot. When order slipped, by the time the second krater of wine was mixed, the room had changed. Not dramatically, not yet, but subtly. Voices were louder. Laughter lasted a little too long. The careful posture of reclining men began to loosen into something less composed. Sandals had been kicked aside. Someone had begun tapping rhythm against the floor. The symposium was entering its second phase. And this was where things became unpredictable. At first, the host still controlled the tempo. The symposiarch would call for another dilution. Perhaps stronger this time, 2 parts water to 1 part wine. A signal that restraint was softening. Cups were refilled. The oil lamps burned lower. Shadows on the walls grew longer and more distorted. The philosophical debates that once revolved around virtue or justice began drifting into more personal territory. Someone challenged another's political loyalty. Someone mocked a recent speech in the assembly. Someone questioned a rival's courage in battle. Wine did not create tension, it revealed it. And Greek society was full of tension. Athens, especially, was a democracy, but a fragile one. Citizens competed constantly for honor, influence, recognition. A symposium brought these men together in one room, removed from public order, but not from ego. The difference was that now they were reclining, drinking, exposed. A careless word could linger longer than the wine itself. Then came the games. Kotabos grew louder. Cups flicked with more force. Targets were missed more often. Cheers turned into jeers. Someone accused another of cheating. Someone demanded a rematch. Music intensified. The flute player's melody grew sharper, more urgent. The rhythm encouraged clapping, then shouting. A guest might begin an improvised song, half poetic, half obscene. Respectability was slipping, and yet this too had structure. The presence of heterae, educated courtesans, shifted the atmosphere further. They were not passive entertainment. Many were skilled conversationalists, musicians, even philosophers in their own right. They sang. They played instruments. They challenged men's arguments. They also reminded everyone that this was not the respectable domestic world of wives and family. This was a male space of performance and status. Desire hovered in the background, not crude, but present. The Greeks believed that wine loosened the soul. Under its influence, truth emerged. This belief made the symposium dangerous, because if wine revealed truth, then every confession, every insult, every boast carried weight. A man who bragged too much was seen as insecure. A man who grew silent might be seen as weak. A man who lost control entirely risked being labeled barbaric. Balance was everything, but balance grew harder to maintain. Eventually, the atmosphere tipped. Someone stood up too quickly and nearly stumbled. Another laughed uncontrollably at something only half funny. A debate turned heated, not intellectually, but emotionally. Voices rose. Hands gestured sharply. The symposium might attempt to restore order, calling for a song, a toast, a shift in topic. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it did not. If it did not, the evening could fracture. A guest might storm out, insulted. Another might challenge someone to a more serious confrontation the next day. Alliances could form in whispers, while others were distracted. The symposium was no longer just a party. It was political theater. And then came the Comos. When the wine bowl was nearly empty and discipline fully dissolved, the gathering could spill into the streets. Torches were grabbed, songs shouted into the night, doors knocked upon, sometimes playfully, sometimes aggressively. Drunken revelers paraded through Athens' narrow streets, singing hymns to Dionysus or bawdy chants about love and rivalry. The controlled indoor ritual transformed into public spectacle. Order had become movement. But here is what makes Greek parties different from modern chaos. The next morning mattered. Everything that happened during the symposium had consequences. In a society built on reputation, public memory was sharp. The assembly would still meet. Legal disputes would still occur. Military service would still demand discipline. You could not separate your drunken self from your public self. They were the same person. That is why you might not survive a Greek party, not physically, socially. The pressure to be clever, composed, entertaining, bold, but not too bold, required skill. The margin between admiration and embarrassment was thin. Too restrained and you were dull. Too wild and you were barbaric. Too quiet and you were forgettable. The perfect Greek man navigated this balance effortlessly. Most did not. By dawn, the oil lamps had burned out. Cups lay tipped over. Music had stopped. The streets grew quiet again. Men returned home with the faint smell of wine clinging to their tunics. The symposium ended, but its memory lingered, because a Greek party was never just about drinking. It was about testing character. Under wine, under scrutiny, under the watchful eyes of a society that never forgot. When the gods entered the room. There is something modern people misunderstand about Greek parties. They imagine them as reckless indulgence, noise, chaos, pleasure without consequence. But to the Greeks, a symposium was never just social, it was sacred. Before the first cup was raised, a libation was poured. Wine tipped carefully onto the ground. An offering to Dionysus, not because they feared him, because they understood him. Dionysus was not just the god of wine. He was the god of transformation, of masks, of altered states, of becoming someone slightly different than you were before. The symposium was not merely a gathering, it was a controlled transformation ritual, and that is why it began slowly. The first round of wine was light. Conversation was sober, jokes were restrained. No one rushed into ecstasy, because ecstasy was powerful, and power required respect. The Greeks believed that wine revealed truth, but they also believed that truth could be dangerous. Under Dionysus, the boundaries between reason and impulse softened. The part of you that normally remained quiet began to speak. Your resentments, your desires, your insecurities, your arrogance, all of it surfaced gently at first, then more boldly, and the room noticed. In many ways, the symposium functioned like a social experiment. Strip away some restraint. Add measured intoxication. Place men of status together in one enclosed room. Observe. What emerges is character. And the Greeks were obsessed with character. Virtue, a rite, mattered. Honor mattered. Reputation mattered. The symposium tested all three. Sometimes the transformation was beautiful. A shy man delivered a brilliant speech about love. A rival admitted admiration for another's poetry. A heated political debate ended in laughter and shared understanding. Wine did not always destroy harmony. Sometimes it revealed connection. But Dionysus was not only gentle, he was also unpredictable. If balance was lost, the room could shift suddenly. A joke crossed a line. A confession went too far. A boast felt like an insult. The energy turned. And once turned, it moved quickly. This is where Greek tragedy and Greek partying overlap. Both explore what happens when emotion overwhelms reason. In tragedy, it leads to downfall. In the symposium, it could lead to humiliation. And humiliation in a society built on honor was not minor. It lingered. There is also something else modern audiences often ignore: the presence of homoerotic tension. Greek symposia were spaces where mentorship, admiration, and attraction blurred. Older men and younger men engaged in intellectual and emotional bonds that were socially structured yet deeply personal. Desire was not hidden, but it was regulated by norms. And, like everything at the symposium, it required balance. Too aggressive, shameful. Too detached, suspicious. The evening was a tightrope. Music intensified the transformation. The olos, a double, reeded flute, produced a piercing, almost hypnotic sound. It vibrated through the small room, blending with laughter and debate. Music in Greek culture was not background noise. It shaped mood. It guided emotion. It moved the room toward ecstasy or calm. At some point, philosophy gave way to storytelling. Guests might recount myths, stories of gods who lost control, heroes who drank too much, kings who trusted flattery. The symposium mirrored these myths. It was myth in miniature. And then, inevitably, the line blurred completely. The structured debate dissolved. The room felt warmer, the air heavier, laughter sharper. Someone sang off key. Someone stood too abruptly. Someone confessed something they would regret in daylight. Dionysus had entered fully. Yet here is the paradox: even chaos had cultural boundaries. The Greeks did not glorify total collapse. They feared it. A man who became violent under wine was not admired. A man who destroyed property was not heroic. Excess without elegance was shameful. The goal was not oblivion. It was controlled surrender. That is why you might not survive a Greek party. Not because it was physically dangerous, but because it required mastery over yourself while appearing relaxed. You had to drink deeply, but not too deeply. Speak boldly, but not recklessly. Laugh loudly, but not foolishly. Desire openly, but not shamelessly. And all of this unfolded in a room where every participant was evaluating every other participant. The symposium was a performance, without a stage, without rehearsal, without forgiveness. By the time dawn approached, the transformation reversed. Wine thinned, voices softened. The first light crept into the room. Reality returned gently, but not completely, because once you have seen someone under Dionysus, you cannot unsee them. The symposium ended. But its revelations did not. That was the true danger. Not the drinking, not the music, not the night, but the exposure. Under wine, under expectation, under the gaze of men who would remember. The morning after, the most important part of a Greek party was not the wine. It was the morning, because the morning decided everything. When the lamps had burned out and the last guest stumbled home, Athens did not disappear. The assembly still met. Court cases were still argued. Soldiers still trained. Merchants still opened their stalls. And you had to walk through that world carrying the memory of the night before. There was no separation between your private self and your public self. The man who laughed too loudly at a crude joke might sit beside you in court. The rival you insulted in drunken pride might vote against you in the assembly. The poet whose verse you mocked might respond with satire sharp enough to damage your reputation. The symposium never truly ended. It followed you. In modern parties, embarrassment fades quickly. In ancient Greece, it lingered. Greek society was built on reputation, honor, public standing. It determined who listened when you spoke, who trusted you in political matters, who respected your opinion. One poorly controlled night could shift perception. Not dramatically, but enough. This is why balance mattered so deeply. The Greeks admired sophrosine, moderation, self-control, harmony within the self. The ideal citizen could enjoy pleasure without being consumed by it. The symposium tested that ideal. If you maintained composure, you were admired. If you revealed insecurity, arrogance, or foolishness, people remembered. And memory, in a city like Athens, was powerful currency. There was also the quiet social sorting that happened after every gathering. Who impressed? Who disappointed? Who formed new alliances? Who isolated themselves? The symposium strengthened networks. Political friendships were reinforced over shared cups of diluted wine. Philosophical schools grew out of conversations begun at these gatherings. Plato did not imagine philosophical debate at a party by accident. That was where ideas actually circulated. But not everyone left empowered. Some left exposed. A man who drank too much might be whispered about. A guest who failed to engage intellectually might be dismissed as dull. A boastful speech might be retold mockingly days later. The symposium was social Darwinism in linen tunics. And then there was the body. Greek parties were long. They stretched deep into the night. Wine was diluted, yes, but consumed steadily. The morning brought dry mouths, headaches, the faint scent of oil lamps, and smoke still clinging to hair and fabric. Yet even physical discomfort carried meaning. It was proof of participation, proof you had been there. But too much visible exhaustion suggested loss of control. Even hangovers had to be worn carefully. The Greeks understood something subtle about pleasure. Pleasure was not dangerous on its own. Lack of control was. And control was not simply physical. It was social, emotional, reputational. This is why the symposium was not chaos disguised as culture. It was culture testing itself. It allowed men to step outside their daytime roles, politician, soldier, citizen, and briefly enter a space shaped by wine and conversation. But the space was never lawless. It was ritualized release, a pressure valve for a society built on honor and competition. And competition never disappeared. Even in laughter, status lingered. Who hosted the most refined gatherings? Who invited the most respected guests? Who quoted Homer most elegantly? Who handled wine most gracefully? These details mattered, because in a city-state, social capital was survival. You might imagine that such intensity would exhaust people, and it did. But it also energized them. The symposium was where ideas sparked, where political strategies formed, where friendships solidified. It was not escape from society. It was society in concentrated form. So how were Greek parties really like? Not reckless chaos, not mindless indulgence, but structured release. Religious ritual woven with social performance. Philosophy mixed with flirtation. Competition softened by music. And always, the quiet understanding that tomorrow would judge tonight. That is why you might not survive one, not because of the wine, but because of the scrutiny. Because in ancient Greece, even pleasure required skill. Even laughter required balance. Even drinking required discipline. The symposium ended with dawn, but its consequences stretched far beyond the night. And that was the true difference between then and now. They did not party to forget who they were. They partied to reveal it. When things went too far, not every Greek party ended with polite laughter and quiet reflection. Sometimes, the balance failed, and when balance failed in ancient Greece, people did not shrug it off. They saw it as a warning. There was always a line between celebration and disgrace, between freedom and chaos, between Dionysian ecstasy and social collapse. Most symposia hovered carefully near that line. Some crossed it. When wine was mixed too strongly, when the symposiarch lost authority, when egos collided too violently, the gathering could shift from controlled ritual to uncontrolled eruption. Arguments escalated. Insults sharpened. Political factions emerged within the room. Remember, Athens was not just a city. It was a democracy filled with ambition. And ambition does not dissolve under wine. It intensifies. There are recorded cases of symposium rivalries turning into real political feuds. A careless insult delivered in jest could be repeated publicly. A sarcastic comment about someone's military service could spread. A moment of vulnerability could be weaponized later. In a society where public honor defined power, words spoken at night could echo for years. And then there was violence. Rare, but not unheard of. A thrown cup. A shove. A challenge issued for a duel or confrontation later. The Greeks valued self-control, but they were also human. Wine lowered thresholds. Pride raised them. When those forces met, the result was unpredictable. Yet interestingly, total chaos was condemned. A man who became truly disorderly under wine was labeled akrates, lacking self-mastery. That was shameful. Civilization, to the Greeks, meant knowing your limits. The symposium tested those limits deliberately. Failing the test damaged reputation. Sometimes, the disorder spilled into the streets. The komos, drunken processions, could become rowdy, even destructive. Revelers might bang on doors, shout songs beneath windows, or parade noisily through marketplaces. To outsiders, it looked wild. To participants, it was the final stage of release. But even this was bounded by expectation. If it crossed into genuine threat or destruction, public opinion turned quickly. Greek society was paradoxical. It allowed space for intoxication, but only within a framework. Too much control made you rigid. Too little control made you barbaric. The ideal citizen moved fluidly between restraint and indulgence. That ideal was almost impossible, which is why so many failed. There is another layer most people ignore. Greek parties were not equal spaces. They were male-dominated, elite-driven. Citizenship mattered. Slaves served but did not participate. Respectable wives remained absent. The symposium was not democratic in attendance, even if it hosted democratic debate. This exclusivity added pressure. To be invited was a sign of status. To perform poorly was to risk exclusion. and exclusion meant diminished influence. So imagine yourself there, reclining among powerful men, expected to be witty, expected to drink gracefully, expected to argue intelligently, expected to maintain dignity while surrounded by music, temptation, and rising intoxication. Now, imagine doing this repeatedly. Your reputation accumulating with each gathering. That is what made Greek parties exhausting. They were not passive leisure. They were social examinations disguised as celebration. And perhaps that is the most surprising truth. The Greeks did not party to escape their society. They partied to rehearse it. The symposium was a miniature version of the polis, the city, state itself. Debate, hierarchy, competition, religion, desire, all compressed into one room. When things went too far, it was not merely embarrassing. It threatened the social fabric, because if self-control failed too often, the distinction between citizen and barbarian blurred, and that distinction mattered deeply to the Greeks. By the time the sun rose and the city returned to routine, the lessons of the night remained. Who could handle power? Who could handle pleasure? Who could handle both at once? That is why Greek parties were dangerous. Not because of excess alone, but because they revealed the thin boundary between civilization and chaos. Under wine, under expectation, under the ever watchful memory of a society that valued honor above all. And once that boundary was crossed, it was very hard to step back. Why they kept doing it. After everything, the pressure, the risk of humiliation, the political tension, the possibility of disgrace. You might wonder, why did they keep doing it? Why gather again and again in dimly lit rooms, lie on couches shoulder to shoulder, and drink under the gaze of gods and rivals alike? Because the symposium was not a weakness in Greek society. It was one of its engines. The Greeks understood something fundamental. A society built entirely on discipline cracks. A society built entirely on indulgence collapses. The symposium existed between those extremes. It was controlled instability. A place where ideas could be tested without bloodshed. Where rivalries could surface without warfare. Where ambition could be measured in words instead of weapons. Wine softened the ego just enough to allow confrontation without immediate violence. Most of the time, Athens in particular was a city of competition. Orators competed for influence. Poets competed for admiration. Generals competed for glory. The symposium gave them a rehearsal space. Here, you could try an argument before presenting it publicly. You could measure reactions. You could observe who laughed, who frowned, who stayed silent. Politics did not begin in the assembly. It often began over diluted wine. Philosophy also grew in these rooms. Plato did not randomly set philosophical dialogue at a party. It reflected reality. Men reclined, debated love, justice, virtue, while slowly becoming intoxicated. This was not seen as contradictory. For the Greeks, wine did not destroy reason. It altered it, sometimes sharpening it, sometimes exposing its limits. There is also something else. The symposium reinforced hierarchy without violence. Status was negotiated through wit, self-control, cultural knowledge. The man who quoted poetry elegantly gained admiration. The one who sang poorly but confidently gained laughter, sometimes respect. It was a meritocratic theater of masculinity. You earned standing not just through wealth or birth, but through performance. And performance could be learned. Yet beneath the structure, there was vulnerability. Because for a few hours, masks slipped, men confessed fears, admitted longing, revealed insecurity. The symposium was one of the few socially sanctioned spaces where emotional exposure was tolerated. Not softness, but intensity. Wine allowed that. Dionysus made it acceptable. He was not merely the god of chaos. He was the god of transformation, of stepping outside rigid identity. In honoring him, the Greeks allowed themselves to loosen the tight armor of public life. But only briefly, because transformation without return is destruction. And they knew that too. So they kept doing it. Because the alternative was worse, a society of constant restraint, constant public performance, constant suppression. The symposium released pressure. It prevented explosion. It allowed the city to breathe. But here is the final irony. The Greeks believed they controlled the balance, that they could approach chaos and step back safely. Most of the time, they could. Sometimes, they could not, and history remembers those moments. Political conspiracies whispered over wine. Alliances formed in shadowed rooms. Philosophical schools emerging from drunken debate. The symposium shaped the intellectual and political landscape of Greece. Quietly, repeatedly. So how were Greek parties actually like? They were structured, competitive, sacred, intellectual, erotic, political, risky, necessary. They were not mindless. They were deliberate spaces where society tested itself. Under music, under wine, under expectation. And if you had been there, reclining on a couch in a smoke-filled room, listening to arguments about love while calculating how much wine you could safely drink without losing face, you might have realized something unsettling. The real danger was not the alcohol, it was the exposure. Because once you reveal who you are under Dionysus, the city never forgets. And in ancient Greece, memory was power. When the masks slipped, there is one final thing most people misunderstand about Greek parties. They imagine masks. But the symposium did not create masks, it removed them. In daylight, an Athenian citizen performed stability, measured speech, controlled posture, public virtue. In the assembly, every word was calculated. In the marketplace, every gesture signaled status. In court, composure was survival. The city demanded performance. The symposium demanded revelation. Wine made that revelation possible. Not because it created truth, because it weakened defense. Under Dionysus, you spoke more freely, but what came out was already inside you. Ambition surfaced. Resentment sharpened. Desire became visible. The symposium did not change who you were. It exposed who you had been pretending not to be. And that is why it was dangerous, not in the obvious sense, but socially, psychologically, politically, because once someone sees your insecurity, they cannot unsee it. Once someone hears your unguarded opinion, it cannot be unheard. Once someone witnesses your imbalance, it becomes part of your reputation. Greek society was obsessed with reputation. Not wealth, not comfort. Reputation. Honor determined influence. Influence determined power. Power determined legacy. And legacy was immortality. To be remembered well mattered more than to live comfortably. The symposium played directly into this. A man who handled wine with elegance proved control. A man who laughed at himself showed confidence. A man who lost composure revealed weakness. These impressions formed silently in the room, and then they traveled, from couch to street, from street to assembly, from assembly to history. But there was also something almost tender about it, because for a few hours, these men were not only politicians or soldiers, they were vulnerable. They sang, they recited poetry about love, they debated beauty and longing, they admitted admiration. Greek masculinity was strict in daylight, but at night it allowed intensity, emotion, attachment. Wine made that socially acceptable. The symposium also blurred hierarchies, briefly. A brilliant argument from a younger man could silence an elder. A courtesan's insight could redirect a philosophical debate. A skilled musician could command the room more effectively than a general. For a moment, talent eclipsed rank. That moment was intoxicating in itself. But dawn restored order, and that is what made the transformation powerful. The Greeks believed in cycles. Order, disorder, return. The symposium followed that rhythm perfectly. It allowed controlled descent, then required disciplined ascent. You could lose yourself, but only temporarily. If you failed to return fully, society would not forgive it. And this is where modern assumptions fail. Greek parties were not about losing identity. They were about testing identity. You entered the room as a citizen. You left the room confirmed or exposed. Imagine reclining there. The oil lamps burning low. The olos vibrating in the air. The krater nearly empty. Someone is telling a myth about heroes who lost control and paid for it. Laughter echoes. But there is awareness underneath it. Everyone knows the boundary. Everyone feels it. The invisible line between cultivated and barbaric, between admired and pitied, between remembered well and remembered poorly. That line is what you would struggle with. Not the drinking, not the philosophy, not even the politics, the line. Because in ancient Greece, excellence required balance. Too rigid, and you were lifeless. Too indulgent, and you were uncivilized. The ideal Greek citizen moved gracefully between both worlds. Very few could. That is why the symposium endured for centuries. It was not frivolous. It was foundational. It trained men to navigate complexity, to argue under pressure, to maintain dignity under intoxication, to reveal truth without collapsing into chaos. And that is the final truth about Greek parties. They were not about escaping society. They were society, compressed into a single room, illuminated by oil lamps, watched by Dionysus, measured by memory, and judged by mourning. After the music stopped, when the last notes of the olos faded, and the final cup lay empty, something invisible remained in the room. Not the wine, not the laughter, not even the arguments, but the knowledge. Because a Greek symposium was not erased by sleep, it was carried forward. The morning after was quieter than people imagine. Athens did not wake in chaos. It woke in routine. Shops opened. Water was drawn from wells. Public debates resumed. But the men who had reclined together the night before now looked at one another differently. They had seen something. Perhaps they had seen a rival lose control. Perhaps they had heard a bold political opinion that would later echo in the assembly. Perhaps they had witnessed a confession that revealed ambition far greater than expected. Whatever it was, the symposium had reshaped perception, and perception in a city-state was power. In Athens, there were no newspapers, no private group chats, no anonymous commentary. Reputation traveled through rooms, through gatherings, through repeated retelling. The symposium was one of the most powerful nodes in that network. What was said there rarely stayed there. And yet, there was an unspoken agreement. Not everything was weaponized. Greek culture understood the necessity of controlled vulnerability. If every drunken confession were used as ammunition, the system would collapse. So, there was restraint, selective memory, a balance between exposure and protection. Even in this, moderation mattered. This delicate equilibrium is what allowed the symposium to endure. Too much betrayal, and no one would speak honestly again. Too much silence, and nothing meaningful would surface. The Greeks walked that line carefully, most of the time. But over time, something deeper happened. The symposium shaped Greek thought itself. Philosophy emerged in environments like these. Debates about love, virtue, governance, beauty. They were not born in sterile lecture halls. They were born in rooms heavy with oil smoke and diluted wine. where men reclined, argued, listened, mocked, refined their ideas, then carried them into the public world. Even art reflected the symposium. Greek pottery is filled with scenes of reclining figures holding cups. Not because it was trivial, because it was central. The act of drinking together symbolized community, status, culture. It was a defining image of Greek identity. But there is something else. The symposium also reinforced exclusion. Slaves served but did not join. Respectable wives remained absent. Citizenship defined participation. It was a space of elite male bonding, and that exclusivity shaped the power structures of the polis. The conversations held in those rooms influenced decisions that affected thousands who were never present. Wine flowed. Ideas formed. History shifted. That is why Greek parties matter. Not because they were wild, but because they were formative. They were the informal engine of formal power. A space where personal relationships intersected with public consequence. And perhaps this is the most unsettling realization. The symposium was not unique to Greece. It was simply visible. Every society has its rooms where influence is negotiated outside official spaces, where laughter softens alliances, where vulnerability strengthens loyalty, where reputation is tested quietly. The Greeks made it ritual. They gave it structure. They gave it a god. So if you had been there, reclining among politicians, poets, generals, philosophers, you might have thought it was only a party. Music, wine, conversation. But you would have been mistaken. You would have been inside one of the most powerful social mechanisms of the ancient world, and surviving it would not have depended on your tolerance for alcohol. It would have depended on your ability to balance intellect, ego, restraint, and performance, to speak boldly but wisely, to drink deeply but gracefully, to reveal yourself, but not too much, because in ancient Greece, even pleasure was political, even laughter was strategic, even wine carried weight. The music stopped, the lamps dimmed, the guests left, but the symposium never truly ended. It simply moved from the couch into the city, and from the city into history. The night you wouldn't survive by now you understand something important. A Greek party was not just drinking. It was evaluation. It was exposure. It was rehearsal for public life. And that is exactly why you probably wouldn't survive one. Dad, not because of the wine. You could learn to drink diluted wine, not because of the music. You could tolerate the olos vibrating in your ears, not even because of the debates. You could prepare a few clever arguments. No. You wouldn't survive because you would underestimate the room. The symposium required constant awareness. You had to read tone shifts instantly. Recognize when a joke crossed into insult. Know when to speak. And when silence was safer. Every reaction was data. Every raised eyebrow. Every delayed laugh. Every glance exchanged across the couch. Ancient Greeks were masters of social perception. They grew up in small city states where everyone knew everyone. There was no hiding behind scale. You would also struggle with the hierarchy. You might assume equality, but the symposium was structured by subtle rank. Who reclined closest to the host? Who was invited repeatedly? Who spoke first? Who interrupted? These were signals. Miss them, and you would misstep. Then there was the expectation of intellectual agility. Imagine reclining while someone asks, "What is courage?" And the room goes quiet. Eyes turn toward you. You are expected to respond, not with a casual opinion, but with something structured, persuasive, elegant. Wine in hand, oil lamps flickering, laughter waiting. You cannot Google an answer. You cannot deflect casually. You must perform. Modern parties allow passivity. Greek symposia did not. If you were quiet all night, you were noticed. If you avoided debate, you were judged. If you drank without participating intellectually, you were shallow. Engagement was mandatory. And engagement was exhausting. And then comes ego. Greek male culture revolved around honor. Small insults were rarely small. A careless comment about someone's poetry could become a long-term rivalry. A poorly timed joke about military service could wound pride deeply. Under wine, pride magnifies, and wounded pride remembers. You might also underestimate the pressure of restraint. You cannot become too wild. You cannot appear too rigid. You must show pleasure, but never surrender to it. It is a paradox. Relax convincingly, but stay in control. Few people can manage both. And then, perhaps most difficult of all, you must handle being seen. Truly seen. The symposium stripped away professional roles. You were not just a politician, not just a soldier, not just a wealthy citizen. You were a man under Dionysus, under expectation, under observation. And once others see your edges, your insecurity, your arrogance, your longing, they remember. This is what makes Greek parties different from modern imagination. They were not escape. They were concentration. All the pressures of society distilled into one room, amplified by wine, illuminated by lamplight, watched by rivals and allies alike. And yet, they kept returning, because the risk was worth the reward. To impress at a symposium meant influence. To charm a room meant status. To argue brilliantly under intoxication meant intellectual authority. The rewards were enormous. But so were the stakes. If you failed, you were not banished. But your image shifted. And in a society built on memory, image was survival. The Greeks did not need social media. They had proximity. They had repetition. They had long memories. So imagine yourself there again. The krater nearly empty. Your cup raised. A question hanging in the air. You feel the warmth of wine in your chest. The room waits. You speak. Your words land. The room reacts. And in that reaction, your future subtly adjusts. That was the true power of a Greek party. It did not end when you left the couch. It followed you into the streets, into politics, into philosophy, into legacy. And that is why, in ancient Greece, a party was never just a party. It was a test of balance, of intellect, of restraint, of identity, under wine, under scrutiny, under a city that never forgot. Because forgetting was not something ancient Greek society did easily. Athens was not a sprawling empire where anonymity swallowed mistakes. It was a compact world of citizens who debated in the same assembly, served in the same military units, worshipped in the same temples, and attended the same gatherings again and again. Reputation circulated like currency, and the symposium was one of its main exchange points. If you impressed the room, you gained more than applause. You gained witnesses, men who would later say, "He speaks well, he thinks clearly, he holds himself with balance." That subtle endorsement mattered. When elections were held, when generals were chosen, when alliances were formed, a single evening could tilt perception, not dramatically, but permanently. But the opposite was also true, a careless boast, an uncontrolled outburst, an insult delivered too sharply. Those moments did not vanish with dawn. They lingered in retelling, and retelling was powerful. Stories moved through the polis faster than decrees, and a story about your lack of self-control could shape how others saw you long after the wine had faded. This is why moderation was not moral decoration. It was survival strategy. The Greeks understood that public life required private discipline. The symposium simply tested that discipline under pressure, under intoxication. Under social heat, there is something almost modern about this dynamic. The fear of being misread, the awareness of being evaluated, the tension between authenticity and performance. But in ancient Greece, the stakes were higher. There were no separate online and offline identities, no curated versions of the self. What you revealed in that room became part of your singular, unified public identity. You could not compartmentalize. And yet, despite all this pressure, the symposium remained desirable, because it offered something rare. A place where intensity was allowed, where emotion could surface, where ideas could clash openly, where wit and courage could shine in ways daily life rarely permitted. The risk was high, but so was the reward. This balance between danger and necessity is what made Greek parties unique. They were not casual. They were ritualized exposure. You entered the room knowing you would be seen more clearly than usual. You drank knowing your guard would lower. You spoke knowing your words would carry beyond the night. And still, you reclined. You raised your cup. You participated, because to withdraw entirely was worse. Silence could be mistaken for weakness. Absence could be interpreted as arrogance. Participation was part of citizenship. The symposium was woven into the fabric of civic life. To navigate it skillfully was proof of belonging, and so the Greek party was never simply about pleasure. It was about integration, learning to exist in tension, between restraint and release, between performance and honesty, between individuality and collective judgment, under scrutiny, under a city that never forgot. The symposium revealed the paradox at the heart of Greek culture. That freedom required discipline. That pleasure required structure. That identity required balance. And if you lost that balance, even briefly, the city would remember. Not loudly, not cruelly, but precisely. Because in ancient Greece, memory was not passive. It was a social force, and the symposium was one of its most powerful instruments. Which is why surviving a Greek party was never about how much you could drink. It was about how much of yourself you could reveal, without losing control of what remained, what the night meant. By now, the oil lamps have burned low. The krater is empty. The cushions are disturbed. The air is thick with the fading scent of wine and smoke. The symposium is over. But what it meant remains. A Greek party was not an escape from life. It was life intensified, compressed into a single room, illuminated by firelight, watched by men who would remember everything. The Greeks did not drink to forget. They drank to reveal, to test, to measure. The symposium was a social crucible. It heated ambition, pride, wit, vulnerability, and showed which elements held their shape. And in a society built on reputation, that mattered more than comfort ever could. What makes this so striking is how deliberate it all was. Wine was diluted. The order of speeches was structured. The symposiarch controlled the pace. Libations honored the gods before indulgence began. Nothing about the Greek party was accidental. Even chaos was ritualized. Even disorder had boundaries. The Greeks believed civilization depended on balance. Too much order created rigidity. Too much excess created barbarism. The symposium existed precisely between those poles. It allowed citizens to flirt with excess without falling into it, to test self-control without destroying it, to explore vulnerability without abandoning honor. But that balance required skill, and that is why you likely would not survive one, not because you would drink too much, but because you would misread the room. You would underestimate how closely you were being observed. You would forget that every joke, every argument, every pause carried weight. You would treat it as leisure. They treated it as performance. In ancient Greece, public and private were not separate realms. They overlapped. The symposium blurred them intentionally. It allowed men to reveal parts of themselves that daylight concealed. But it never allowed them to escape consequence. The morning always returned, and with it, judgment. Yet, despite the risk, the symposium endured for centuries. Because it worked, it strengthened alliances, refined ideas, tested leadership, built cultural identity. Even Greek philosophy, which shaped Western thought for millennia, found one of its earliest dramatic settings in a drinking party. That is not coincidence. It reflects reality. The Greek party was not shallow. It was foundational. It trained citizens to balance intellect and emotion, to argue fiercely without collapsing into violence, to drink deeply without surrendering dignity, to exist in tension without breaking. And perhaps that is the final lesson. The symposium was not about losing control. It was about proving you could approach the edge and step back, about showing that you could enter Dionysus' domain without becoming consumed by it, about revealing yourself, but not too much. When dawn came, the city resumed, markets opened, debates continued, laws were argued, but beneath the routine, memory lingered of who had impressed, of who had faltered, of who had balanced perfectly between restraint and ecstasy. That is how Greek parties were actually like. Structured, sacred, competitive, intimate. Dangerous, but not because of violence. Dangerous because they exposed identity. Under wine, under scrutiny, under a city that never forgot. And if you had reclined there, cup in hand, surrounded by rivals and allies alike, you would have realized something unsettling. The real test was never how much you could drink. It was whether you could remain yourself while everyone watched. And in ancient Greece, everyone was always watching. When the lamps went out, eventually, every symposium ended the same way. The wine thinned. The voices softened. The oil in the lamps burned low. Someone stood carefully, steadying themselves before stepping back into the night air of the city. And for a moment, just a moment, there was quiet. That quiet mattered, because it was the space between who you were in the room and who you would be remembered as outside it. Ancient Greece was not forgiving in the way modern societies sometimes pretend to be. There were no disappearing posts, no forgotten nights, no clean separations between private indulgence and public identity. You were one person, and that person carried everything forward. The symposium was never about excess alone. It was about proximity to excess. How close you could move toward chaos without dissolving into it. How near you could stand to Dionysus without becoming ruled by him. The Greeks understood that civilization was fragile. They believed it had to be rehearsed, tested, strengthened through controlled exposure. The party was rehearsal. For leadership, for argument, for temptation, for power. That is why the Greeks did not fear the symposium. They feared imbalance. They feared becoming too rigid to feel, or too indulgent to function. The symposium trained citizens to exist between those extremes, to speak boldly but not foolishly, to drink deeply but not collapse, to reveal emotion without surrendering discipline. It was not escape, it was calibration. And yet, for all its structure, something unpredictable always hovered in the air. Because once wine enters the body, certainty leaves it. A single careless sentence could shift alliances. A single brilliant argument could elevate status. A single loss of control could define a man for years. The room was small. The consequences were not. By dawn, Athens looked unchanged. Stone walls still stood. Temples still gleamed in the early light. Market stalls still opened. But beneath the surface, subtle adjustments had occurred. Relationships had shifted. Perceptions had hardened or softened. Ambitions had grown clearer. The symposium had done its work. And that is the final truth. Greek parties were not distractions from society. They were instruments of it, places where identity was refined under pressure, where hierarchy was negotiated through wit instead of warfare, where philosophy and politics mixed with music and wine, where the gods were honored not through silence, but through intensity. If you had been there, reclining on a couch, cup warming in your hand, listening as debate turned to confession and laughter turned to insight, you might have felt exhilarated. You might have felt powerful. You might have felt exposed. All three were correct, because a Greek party did not ask you to forget who you were. It asked you to demonstrate it. Under scrutiny, under expectation, under the watchful memory of a city that never forgot. And when the lamps finally went out, and the last footsteps faded into the narrow streets, what remained was not the wine, it was the impression. And in ancient Greece, an impression could shape a lifetime. That was the symposium, not chaos, not mindless indulgence, but civilization testing itself, one cup at a time.